TRT World correspondent Joseph Hayat joins me now. He is a qualified pilot and an aviation commentator. Great to have you with us.
Pleasure's mine.
2 bankruptcy filings for Alitalia in less than a decade. How did Alitalia get to this stage?
Well, the history is quite extensive, isn't it? I mean, if we go back just beyond over a century, we saw in the late 90s the rise of the low-cost carriers really surging and penetrating the market. Beyond that, we obviously had the tragedy of 9/11, fuel prices surged, and the Alitalia fleet simply wasn't ready for it. They were still operating the old McDonnell-Douglas MD-11s. They weren't fuel efficient, they weren't twin-engine aircraft like we see behind us, so they weren't ready then. Fast forward to 2009, of course, we saw the Air France KLM step in, trying to acquire a lot more equity in the firm after its initial bankruptcy. And I think the hope there was that it was going to take forward the Air France KLM ethos and try and fill into the gap that they had of a more need for more aircraft and frequency at that time. We were beginning to see growth again in the industry. They brought them into SkyTeam, and it was successful in that regard to make sure that obviously passengers could transit more frequently and have a variety of routes to choose from. But the product wasn't there, of course. 2009, things like in-flight entertainment, IFE was a commonality, and the fleet still wasn't ready. I mean, aircraft like the A330, the Boeing 777, they're only slowly starting to come into the fleet by then. Beyond that, we saw the most recent investment from Etihad, and many thought, well, okay, are we going to see an increase in service and quality, you know, bring it up to the Etihad standard? And sadly, the product still was too aged. Obviously, you have to have sufficient aircraft technology to really stand out. You either have to be a premium carrier in this market or a budget carrier. Legacy carriers like British Airways, they're somewhere in between.
The middle ground has been eaten away.
Yeah.
So a lot of management missteps, but the industry as a whole has also changed over the last 10 years. There's a lot more competition now, isn't there?
There certainly is. We will always see, for example, on legacy routes such as those to the United States, there is always going to be that stiff competition where the legacy or the premium carriers will always win. But low cost and budget is absolutely key to the industry at the moment. And as you know, you saw in the previous reports on today's show, even Boeing's profits continue to surge at record. Why? Because the aircraft operators, the airlines are continuing to order the aircraft, and it's growing. Low-cost carriers, EasyJet, Ryanair, they're absolutely right to put the bid in for Alitalia's fleet because they're predominantly Airbus A320s, A321s. They're ideal fit-ins to their fleet, and it could make it work.
And also because of their cost base would allow them to service these kinds of planes more cheaply because they would fit into what they already have. Let's talk about Brexit for a second. How is Brexit going to affect the European aviation sector?
There's great speculation at the moment because of all the airline operators, pilots, etc. We all operate under the EASA, that's European Air Safety Aviation Network, and that is the commonality, if you like, amongst airline and aircraft and airport operators. Now, the question is, if obviously the UK does withdraw from the European Union, how is that going to affect aviation law within the United Kingdom? And there is speculation that, for example, currently if EasyJet were to fly from London Stansted, London Luton to, say, Paris, to maximise their fleet operations and efficiency, they would perhaps continue that aircraft onward to Amsterdam from Paris and then return perhaps to London Stansted or Luton. The question there is, well, if the UK is no longer part of the European Union, can those airline operators and with the UK-owned registered aircraft and British crews actually have the legal right to then take that aircraft from, say, Paris to Amsterdam?
Let's go back to this issue of competition. It is squeezing a lot of airlines' margins, as we've said, but it's also been good in terms of airfares. It's been good for consumers. But as we see more consolidation in the industry, could we see those airfares start to come up?
On some routes, yes, and on some routes, no. It's not a simple answer, I'm afraid. Certainly in the mid to short haul range of the market, absolutely, we will probably see fares potentially decrease or kind of stagnate and stabilise. But certainly for long haul legacy routes, as I say, to the United States, to Canada, these kind of countries across the Atlantic operations, they will continue to be fiercely competitive. And I fear that for certainly the mid ground, as I say, IAG and companies and operations like that, they're certainly going to potentially see increases on routes where they have the right to try and warrant that price.
Fantastic. Joseph Hayat, thank you very much indeed.